What started as routine late-night television turned into an explosive confrontation that left America stunned. Senator Bernie Sanders walked off Stephen Colbert's show after a heated exchange about healthcare policy spiraled completely out of control. The Late Show's studio buzzed with its usual pre-show energy as Senator Bernie Sanders settled into the guest chair opposite Stephen Colbert. The 82-year-old Vermont progressive had appeared on the show dozens of times before, their conversations typically marked by playful banter and mutual respect. Tonight felt different from the moment Sanders walked onto the set. Colbert's opening monologue had taken several pointed jabs at progressive politicians, drawing uncomfortable laughter from the studio audience. Behind the scenes, producers noticed Sanders seemed unusually tense during makeup, repeatedly asking about the show's planned topics. The senator's staff had specifically requested that certain subjects be off-limits, but Colbert's team had made no such promises. As the interview began, Colbert wore his trademark grin, but there was something sharper in his demeanor tonight. "Senator Sanders, welcome back to the show," he said, his voice carrying an edge that regular viewers might have missed. "I have to ask about your recent comments regarding Medicare for all. Some critics are saying you're still pushing the same tired talking points from 2016. Sanders shifted in his chair, his famous Brooklyn accent growing more pronounced. "Stephen, I think what's tired is watching millions of Americans go bankrupt because they can't afford insulin while insurance companies make record profits." The audience applauded, but Colbert's smile never wavered. "Right, but isn't it a bit hypocritical? Coming from someone who owns 3 homes?" Colbert shot back, his tone becoming increasingly confrontational. "I mean, you're talking about economic inequality while living pretty comfortably yourself." The studio fell silent. Sanders' jaw tightened visibly, his hands clenching the armrests of his chair. This wasn't the usual playful ribbing between host and guest. The senator had faced this criticism countless times, but something about Colbert's delivery felt particularly malicious tonight. "That's a Republican talking point, Stephen, and frankly I'm surprised to hear it from you," Sanders replied, his voice rising slightly. "My family worked hard for what we have, and I've been fighting for working families my entire career. Those are 2 completely different things." Colbert leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with what looked like genuine malice, rather than comedic timing. "But Senator, how can voters trust someone who preaches about the 1% while clearly being part of it himself? Doesn't that make you just another Washington hypocrite?" The audience grew increasingly uncomfortable, sensing this had moved far beyond typical late-night television territory. Sanders' face flushed red, his legendary temper beginning to surface. Staff members backstage exchanged worried glances, some reaching for their phones to alert the senator's team. "I've dedicated my life to fighting inequality," Sanders said, his voice now carrying real anger. "While you sit here making jokes and collecting CBS paychecks, I'm in the Senate trying to pass legislation that would actually help people. Maybe you should focus on doing some real journalism instead of cheap shots." The comment hit its mark. Colbert's facade of comedic detachment cracked completely, revealing something much uglier underneath. His voice dropped to a cold whisper that the microphones barely picked up. "Real journalism? From someone who couldn't even beat Hillary Clinton? That's rich, Bernie." Sanders stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the studio floor. The audience gasped audibly as the 82-year-old senator pointed directly at Colbert, his entire body trembling with rage. "How dare you?" he said, his voice carrying across the stunned studio. "How absolutely dare you?" But Colbert wasn't finished. Rising from behind his desk with theatrical slowness, he delivered what would become the most controversial moment in late-night television history. "You know what, Bernie?" Colbert said, his voice dripping with condescension as he walked around his desk toward the senator. "Maybe the real problem isn't the system. Maybe it's just you. Maybe you're nothing more than an angry old man shouting at clouds, and the American people figured that out a long time ago. The studio audience sat in complete silence, many covering their mouths in shock. This wasn't comedy anymore. This was character assassination happening live on national television. Sanders' face went from red to nearly purple, his hands shaking as he processed what he'd just heard. "You want to talk about helping people?" Colbert continued, moving closer to Sanders' chair. "Where were you when we needed real leadership? When Trump was in office, you were too busy fighting your own party to actually accomplish anything meaningful. Face it, Senator, you're yesterday's news trying to stay relevant." The production staff backstage scrambled frantically. Producers screamed into their headsets, trying to figure out if they should cut to commercial. The show's director kept the cameras rolling, perhaps sensing they were witnessing television history, albeit for all the wrong reasons. Sanders took a deep breath, visibly trying to compose himself. For a moment it seemed like he might sit back, down and attempt to salvage the interview, but Colbert had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "Stephen," Sanders said slowly, his voice barely controlled, "I've been in public service since before you were born. I've fought for civil rights, worker protections, and health care for all Americans. I don't need some late-night comedian who's never held real responsibility in his life telling me about leadership." Colbert's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Public service? Is that what we're calling career politicians now? You've been in Washington for over 30 years, Bernie. What exactly do you have to show for it? A few post offices renamed?" The insult landed like a physical blow. Sanders' legendary composure finally shattered completely. "How dare you trivialize my record?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the studio. "While you've been making jokes, I've been fighting to keep people alive. I've been trying to save democracy itself." "Democracy?" Colbert sneered. "You mean the same democracy where you couldn't even win your own party's nomination? Twice?" He paused dramatically, savoring the moment. "Maybe the problem isn't the Democratic establishment, Bernie. Maybe they just knew better than to trust you with real power." The audience began murmuring uncomfortably, some people standing up as if to leave. Several members started pulling out their phones, recording what was quickly becoming a social media nightmare for CBS. The show's warm-up comedian, watching from the wings, looked physically ill. Sanders stood up again, this time with purpose. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I've spent my entire career fighting for people who don't have a voice, people who can't afford health care, who work 3 jobs just to survive. And you're sitting here mocking that work?" "I'm not mocking your work," Colbert replied with fake sincerity. "I'm questioning whether it was ever really work at all, or just performance art for the cameras." That was the final straw. Sanders' face contorted with rage as he stepped toward Colbert, close enough that the host instinctively took a step back. "You know nothing about real work," Sanders hissed. "Nothing about real struggle. You sit in your ivory tower making millions while real people suffer, and you have the audacity to lecture me." The tension in the studio reached a breaking point. Security guards positioned themselves strategically around the set, unsure whether to intervene or let the confrontation play out. The audience had gone completely silent, witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television. Colbert, perhaps realizing he'd pushed too far, attempted to regain control. "Senator, maybe we should—" "No," Sanders interrupted, his voice now thunderous. "You wanted this fight, Stephen. You wanted to humiliate me on national television. Well, congratulations." Sanders turned toward the audience, his voice carrying across the stunned studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what passes for journalism. Today, personal attacks instead of substantive discussion, character assassination instead of holding power accountable." His words cut through the silence like a blade. Colbert's face flushed as he realized the interview had spiraled completely beyond his control. "Senator, I think you're being a bit dramatic." "Dramatic?" Sanders whirled back toward him, eyes blazing. "You just spent 10 minutes attacking my character, my career, and my integrity. You turned what should have been a discussion about health care into a personal vendetta. And I'm being dramatic? The senator began removing his microphone with deliberate, measured movements. Each action felt weighted with significance as the cameras continued rolling. I've been on dozens of talk shows, Stephen. I've faced tough questions, legitimate criticism, even hostile interviews. But what you did tonight wasn't journalism. It wasn't even entertainment. It was cruelty. Colbert attempted to salvage the situation, his comedian's instincts kicking in. Come on, Bernie, can't you take a joke? This is late-night television. A joke? Sanders' voice rose to a roar that seemed to shake the studio. Mocking my life's work is a joke to you? Dismissing decades of fighting for working families is comedy? He threw his microphone down on the chair, the sound echoing through the dead-silent studio. The audience sat frozen, many with their mouths agape. This wasn't the folksy, passionate Bernie Sanders they knew from campaign rallies. This was a man whose dignity had been systematically torn apart on live television, and his anger was righteous and terrifying. You know what the real joke is, Stephen? Sanders continued, his voice now carrying a dangerous calm. The joke is that you have a platform that reaches millions of Americans, and instead of using it to discuss the real issues facing this country, you use it for cheap shots and personal attacks. The joke is that you call yourself a comedian when there's nothing funny about what you just did. Colbert stood speechless as Sanders gathered his composure one final time. The senator straightened his jacket and looked directly into the camera, addressing the audience at home rather than the host who had ambushed him. To the American people watching this, I want you to know that this is exactly what's wrong with our media today. Instead of discussing how we can make healthcare affordable, or how we can address climate change, or how we can create good-paying jobs, we get personal attacks and character assassination. This is why people have lost faith in our institutions. Sanders began walking toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the silent studio. But he stopped at the edge of the stage and turned back one final time. Stephen, I genuinely feel sorry for you. You had an opportunity tonight to have a meaningful conversation about issues that matter to millions of Americans. Instead, you chose to be small. You chose to be mean. And that says everything about who you really are. With that, Bernie Sanders walked off the set of The Late Show, leaving Stephen Colbert standing alone on his stage, the studio audience still in shocked silence. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Colbert's stunned expression as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Within hours, clips of the confrontation exploded across social media. The hashtag #ThatYouRespectBernie began trending worldwide as viewers expressed outrage at Colbert's behavior. Major news outlets picked up the story, with many condemning the host's unprofessional conduct. CBS's phone lines were flooded with complaints, from viewers demanding accountability. The Late Show's ratings plummeted in the following weeks as sponsors began pulling their advertisements. Colbert issued a half-hearted apology days later, but the damage was done. The incident became a watershed moment in late-night television, sparking conversations about the difference between legitimate criticism and personal attacks in media. Sanders, meanwhile, received an outpouring of support from across the political spectrum. His dignified response to Colbert's ambush was praised as a masterclass in handling hostile media, and his approval ratings actually increased following the incident. The confrontation ultimately served as a stark reminder that respect and professionalism should never be sacrificed for ratings or shock value, and that true strength lies not in tearing others down, but in standing up for one's principles when faced with cruelty.